This lecture is being brought to you in part by the generous gifts of these sponsors.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ford, and also for this invitation. I'm super pleased to be here. This is an amazing place. So I was in Germany. I'm originally a German citizen, and I was at the Max Planck in Berlin for many, many years. And this totally reminds me of the institute where I grew up, where the focus is on science and just fantastic things are coming out and very good discussions, and even just a few hours that I had the opportunity to hang out here. And I think this is a very unique opportunity to get the word out. I don't know of a lot of events like this, so I think this is very fantastic that this is possible to happen. And I would like to tell you a little bit about oxytocin and human aging, the line of research, one of the lines of research that we're doing in my lab, where we try to demonstrate that the oxytocin system is involved in cognitive and socioemotional function in aging, and we take a look from both behavior and the brain. And I would like to start out by, reminding you of something that you're probably very familiar with at this point, namely that we have a growing society. So older adults are the fastest growing population segment in industrialized nations, including the US. And you see here in this animated slide actual as well as projected data from the Census Bureau across the different ages. Actually, I should use my pointer here to make it easier. Here, across the different ages, the decades. And as the slide develops, you see that it's particular these older age groups, 60 and older, and here you see the over 80-year-olds that are growing in size. So we really have an aging population. And this makes it very clear, this demographic shift makes it very clear that we need to understand the aging process. And not only that, but we need to develop ways in which we can not only live longer, but live longer better. So really trying to promote successful, independent, happy aging. And that's one of the big goals that I pursue in my research. I want to give you a little bit of a broader umbrella background from the conceptual framework that we're working off in my lab. I was trained in lifespan developmental psychology. This is the idea that development does not only happen early in life, and then, once you're 25, you're set, nothing's going to happen anymore. It's really this idea that we're developing across the entire lifespan, and this actually starts prenatally, young ages, then through the middle ages here, and then into old age, and even after our death, development goes on. People we know think about us and these kind of things. This is an approach that maybe emerged about 30 years ago now, more vehemently in developmental psychology, and has been followed by a lot of scholars since then. And one of the big propositions in lifespan psychology is that of a changing gain-loss ratio across the lifespan. And this is depicted here, where you have the expected ratio of gains to losses. And in early phases of life, there's a lot of gains, okay? As a child, you learn to walk, you learn to talk, you make new friends, everything gets better. And it's very non-normative to have loss experience in those early phases of life. It does happen, but it's not the norm, the age norm. As you move through life, the ratio becomes a little bit more, okay, losses start kicking in. But even in sort of young and middle-aged adulthood, is usually still an overweight of gain experiences and in everyday life across all sorts of functional domains, social, emotional, cognition, and so on. However, as we get older, losses take over. But what is very important to see here is it's not all a loss story in old age. There's room for gains. There is very relevant work, for example, in the context of wisdom, life expertise, life experience, also in emotion regulation, how we're responding to other individuals, even in physical and cognitive function. There's plasticity, there's room for gains. And in my lab, we're trying to focus a little bit more on this gain aspect, but also considering the losses and trying to find out what can we do to decrease losses and increase gains in very old age. And one approach we have taken in this context is to look at oxytocin. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that. That's our roadmap for today. I'm going to tell you why studying oxytocin and aging. Why have we started this? Why is this interesting? Why might this tell us something about aging? So a little bit more here, the rationale and the theoretical approach that we're taking. And then we'll dive into some empirical findings in the second part of the talk from mostly 2 studies that we have completed or almost completed for the second one at this point. Well, I'll show you some published and then also some hot off the press, not yet published, but very promising looking data on oxytocin's possible effects on benefiting function in aging, and our sort of idea of can we maybe make it implemented as a safe treatment to promote successful aging. So let's get started. Just some faces quickly that you can associate with this research. It's the folks who have originally started this work with me, Dr. Feifel, psychiatrist in California, Dr. Håkan Fischer in Sweden. He was really, he and I, we basically started this idea together, studying oxytocin and aging. And then I have many more students helping now, but this was sort of like the original 3 folks who were helping to get all this research on oxytocin and aging up 6 years ago, shortly after I moved to University of Florida. Okay, so what is the neuropeptide oxytocin? It's a 9 amino acid peptide. It is synthesized in the hypothalamus, in specific cells in the hypothalamus. It is released both into the periphery. There's different organs that have, as we know, oxytocin receptors where it binds, but it is also released directly in the brain to key regions such as the amygdala. You might have heard about the amygdala, really very involved in salient information, emotional information, hippocampus, and striatum. So all these are also part of the reward network and so on and so forth. Oxytocin is both. It is a hormone and a neurotransmitter. So again, it functions in the periphery and it functions in the brain centrally. And it can be studied on very many different levels. So we can, measure the concentration, we can count cells, we can look at genetics and epigenetics. So it's a very big field, like with any hormone and neurotransmitter. Originally, and that's also where you might have heard about oxytocin at first, it was known mostly for its role in labor and lactation. But I'm sure several of you have heard about the love hormone. It's been in the press for quite a bit. But it's really only, I would say, 20 years now, 15, 20 years now, that people have looked at oxytocin more specifically in the context of social and emotional processes. So bonding, exchanges between a parent and a child in humans and animals. And there has been also quite some work on its role in physical health, so in terms of pain, for example, and inflammation, and I'll only briefly talk about this because this is very new projects where I don't have firm data yet. But it's been shown quite extensively at this point now in the literature that oxytocin plays a role in what's called social cognition, so the processing and responding to social information, so for example, other people's faces, remembering other people's faces, reading emotions in other people's faces. And it seems that oxytocin facilitates some of these processes. There's some mixed literature, but overall it seems to be beneficial for some of these social cognitive functions. By the way, that's also why it's often discussed and researched in the context of schizophrenia as well as autism, because those pathologies actually have often very pronounced impairments in social cognition, in the process of processing of social information. And then also in terms of trust, cooperation, so there are studies out there suggesting oxytocin increases our willingness to trust other people, especially when they're from our own group, so in group, my own age group or my own gender and so on. So there is a bunch of evidence out there of functional benefits in these domains from oxytocin and involvement of the system. However, these studies are mostly done in young male individuals, and of course some clinical groups like the schizophrenic and autistic patients, but not in aging and also not so much in women yet, other than childbirth and lactation, but not in the social cognitive process. And as a researcher who's interested in aging, I was of course very surprised when I read, oh, that's the things that oxytocin does. Why does no one look in aging? Because that's exactly the things, physical health, social cognition, socioemotional functioning, these things change with age. So why has no one looked how oxytocin plays out in aging? And that's really literally like 6 years ago when I realized this together with my colleague Håkan in Sweden, that there basically is no research out there in humans, or very little, into age changes in the oxytocin system and how this might affect function in different, cognition, socioemotional functioning, affective functioning, and so on in aging. And so what we did was we wrote a review paper in 2013, and actually at the same time another group in Europe wrote a very similar paper. It happens, sometimes you think, oh, great idea, and then someone else has the same idea. Still means it's a great idea, and they actually were even quicker to get it out than us, okay, like a year before us. But it has slightly different points. So what we realized very quickly was there isn't much research out there, and the research that is out there is very hard to compare. Some is in rats, other research is in non-human primates or some monkeys. Some is in humans, but typically post-mortem. And so we tried to summarize that literature and found that some studies suggest stability of the oxytocin system in aging, no change. And then other studies said, well, there's change in the oxytocin system in aging. It goes up, it goes down. So pretty wild, pretty mixed evidence. So we knew, okay, we're going to spend the next few years on this topic, probably all of our research career on this topic, to figure out what's going on. And that's how we started this process. We, as part of this review paper, came up with this framework. It's not really a model. It's more like an approach we're taking in our studies, where we are looking at aging and with a specific eye toward oxytocin, but with respect to all three, genetics and epigenetic processes. So there's oxytocin receptor gene and other genes related to the oxytocin system that can be studied across the adulthood and aging. We look in the brain, neurobiology, these target regions that I mentioned before, amygdala, hippocampus, and so on. But we also have to look in behavior. And we're ideally trying to do this all in one study if we can, so that we get a very comprehensive picture of the oxytocin system in aging. And that's what we're trying to do in the studies that I'm going to show you. So that gets us to the second part, where we're going to dive into empirical work. So I'll show you some data of the 2 oxytocin intervention studies we've done so far at the University of Florida. This research was actually also heavily motivated by a development around 2000, where it became clear that we have oxytocin naturally occurring in our body, but we can also artificially enhance it through a very simple intervention, namely a nasal spray. It's basically like Flonase, it's a simple spray, you administer it, and there is assumptions that it enters the brain. So it doesn't just stay in the periphery. So in childbirth, for example, oxytocin is typically administered intravenously. It's different. This here through the nose is supposed to directly tap into central functions, into brain actions, and possibly through the trigeminal or olfactory nerve pathways. But there's a lot of research out still there to figure out how exactly does it get in the brain, how much actually gets into the brain through this way, and so on. And one of the target regions is hypothalamus, but also, as I said, amygdala. And oxytocin has very long-ranging projections. It doesn't just stay in one place in the brain. So even, it travels across the brain once it enters the system. So that research and that application route was very relevant for our research. So I'm showing you here the first study we did about 4 years ago. It was a single dose administration study. So a single application, we also call it acute application of intranasal oxytocin. And we had in this study generally healthy young and older individuals. We had both male and female because, as I told you, women had not been studied very much. And we definitely wanted to make sure to understand a bit more about young women, but also compare in aging men and women. And this was a between subject design, which means about half of the participants got oxytocin intranasal intervention, and the other half got placebo in each of those age groups. It was a community sample. We very extensively pre-screened. This is an investigational drug, so we don't have any evidence that it has side effects, but it's not something that's FDA approved, so that means the ethic process is a little bit more complicated, and it hadn't been studied in older individuals yet, so we had to go through some hoops here, and we made sure everyone's safe in the study, and everyone, is also safe to go in the MRI scanner, because remember, we were administering through the nose to see action in the brain. So one way of looking at this is using neuroimaging, such as magnetic resonance imaging, and that's what we did in this study. Just quickly, the design overview, pre-screening, as I mentioned, making sure people are safe and also people are in the right age ranges and all of this. Then everyone came in for one session in which we drew blood to also, again, make sure they are eligible for the study, but we also wanted to be able to measure baseline naturally occurring oxytocin levels in these folks. And we had some assessments of personality and cognition and also attachment. So how are they leading their adult relationships? And I'll talk about that data in a second. Then they came back between 2 and 10 days later, and this in-person full visit was the actual oxytocin administration. So at this time, it was basically just baseline measurements of oxytocin. They came back, and here we administered 24 international units. It's the standard approach in these one-time administration studies, and we did a bunch of different measures right after we gave them the self-administered the oxytocin. And then we made sure a week later that everyone's okay, and also so that we could actually start collecting some safety data. So I'm showing you first some data that's before the intranasal intervention, so the first visit. What we found was that the level of oxytocin, the plasma concentration, so the level in the blood of oxytocin naturally occurring before we intervened in any way, varied quite a bit between our young male, young female, older male, and older female participants. We found an effect for sex, so women have higher oxytocin levels than men, and especially young women had the highest level. And what I found very important, maybe because it was my hypothesis, which was not statistically supported but numerically supported, was that older men were the ones with the lowest oxytocin levels in our sample. And there was actually a significant difference between the young women and the older men if we tested that. So older men, start with the lowest levels. Keep that in mind, because what I'm trying to tell you once I show you the intervention data is, I think what we're seeing is maybe because they start out low, when we intervene and enhance the levels, they benefit most, the older men. We don't see that same effect in the older women. All right, so let's take a look still at the baseline levels. Okay, baseline oxytocin levels are depicted in this graph here, up here. And here you have a measure of processing speed, which is basically how quick can we do things. It's a little task where you have to fill in some numbers. And some people in cognition argue that processing speed underlies basically all cognition. If your processing speed goes down with age, most of your other cognitive components go down with age, and processing speed goes down typically with age. What we see here in our data is basically a positive relationship between oxytocin and processing speed. So naturally occurring levels of oxytocin, if they're higher, people tended to also have higher processing speed in our little task. And this was actually true for everyone. This was not just true for the people who started out low. This was a general linear trend in our data. And similarly, we saw a positive beneficial profile for this self-reported measure that we gave participants about their adult relationships, their attachment styles, how they are relating to other close people in their life. This was just a short self-report measure with items such as, you can't really read it, probably small, I worry that romantic partners won't care about me as much as I care about them, was a measure for the anxiety measure, for which we saw relationships here, namely that at least for these three groups, not for the young women, but for the other age by gender subgroups, there was somewhat of a negative trend in that higher oxytocin levels were associated with lower, should actually point here so you see it, higher oxytocin, sorry, I'm pointing the right, higher oxytocin levels were associated with lower anxiety measures. Okay, so suggesting a potentially beneficial association between high oxytocin levels and cognition, and high oxytocin levels and reduced anxiety in interpersonal relations in these folks in the study. Okay, now we're moving on to the intranasal intervention. Remember, they came again 2 to 10 days later, and we actually enhanced the system centrally through nasal spray. And what we saw here was, again, going back to an emotional measure here, we call it meta mood. It's, again, a self-report measure we used here, basically asking people, how much do you attend to your own emotions, and how clear are you about your own emotions? How much do you understand your own moods and feelings? And what we found was that there was actually, again, in the older men, an effect that those older individuals who received the oxytocin spray reported higher attention and also higher clarity of their own emotions when compared with older men who received the placebo spray. And actually a similar effect was found in the young women, but not in the young men and also not in the older women. So again, I'm circling here the older men because the story that starts shaping up in our data is young women also benefit, but I'm interested in aging, and it seems to be more the older men who benefit from this single dose here, intervention that I'm showing you here. But the final word is not spoken on this. We have not examined women enough at this point. As I told you, I'm interested in the brain and looking at mechanisms of oxytocin in the brain. So in the same folks, we had them go in the MRI scanner after the oxytocin intervention. And what we did, among other things, was we looked at the brain at rest. This is called resting state functional connectivity. It basically means you look at not just one region in the brain, as it's not doing anything, but it's also not engaging in a task. It's just resting, and the brain is never not doing anything, okay? It might just not do a math task, but it's still thinking maybe about yourself or some other people or whatever it does when you're resting. So basically, functional connectivity means not just looking at one region, but the connection between 2 or more regions. And in our case, we specifically focused on amygdala. You've heard that before. We know there's oxytocin receptors in amygdala. It's one of the target regions of the oxytocin system. So connectivity between amygdala and a region in the front of the brain called medial prefrontal cortex, kind of like here. These 2 regions are very relevant when it comes to processing social and emotional information. And people call those regions part of the social brain or emotional brain. So we targeted those regions because we knew they're relevant in oxytocin, in the oxytocin system, but also because they are known to be really relevant for social and emotional processes. And indeed, what we found was the oxytocin intervention, this one-time administration of oxytocin, increased the communication between those 2 regions. So we don't know which of those talked with the other one, we don't know the direction. We just know that they swing together, okay? At the same time, they are active. That's all this means. But it boosts this communication, and it could have many different effects. I mean, some people argue that oxytocin reduces anxiety, and that would make sense. The prefrontal cortex controls the amygdala in many instances. It could tell, after oxytocin administration, it could tell the amygdala, shut down, there's nothing to worry about, chill out, be mellow. That could be what we're seeing here. We don't know. We can't read the brain to that extent. We can just kind of look and then infer. But it was really exciting. And again, it was in the young women and in the older men that we saw this effect, driven by those 2 groups. The other effects, when we split it out, the other groups, when we split it out, did not show this specific increased coupling between those 2 regions. Okay, so this quick summary from the single-dose administration study and those naturally occurring levels that we talked about, pretty promising first evidence that these natural levels that we just have as we go through life vary by age and sex, specifically sex difference was significant, but remember the older men had the lowest levels. And not only that, but oxytocin levels naturally occurring seem to have some connection with functional domains, including cognition and attachment. And then when we intervene with the single dose administration in these folks, we see that we can modulate the brain. So we can modulate this connectivity between 2 regions that are really relevant for social and emotional processing, among other things. And we also see some effect on self-reported, it's not actually behavior, but on some self-reported measure of knowing about your own feelings and moods and so on. And again, we saw some age and by sex variations. And I just want to make that point again here that the jury is still out there, but from what we're seeing so far, maybe this is something that works particularly well in older men, and maybe because they start out low, both in oxytocin levels, but also in terms of performance in some of these tasks. So some of these like socioemotional tasks, women are pretty good at, and men maybe not so. So again, that's maybe where the booster comes in for the older men a little bit. Sorry, it's a stereotype probably, so maybe we can cut this out of the recording, but we're trying to interpret the data as scientists, as we're seeing it, to make sense of it. All right. What we didn't know after this study, and nobody else had really looked at this, was what happens when we give oxytocin more than once in aging? Because really, if we want to start talking about this as a possible intervention, just giving it once isn't going to last the whole life. It's not going to, that's very unrealistic realistic to think you give it once and then you're good for the rest of your life. So we wanted to find out what happens if we do a longer-term administration of intranasal oxytocin in aging, a chronic administration, as we call it. And we have just recently published, if you're interested in, you can find it online, a review paper on what's out there at this point in terms of chronic administration. And there's nothing on oxytocin and chronic administration and aging. But there is some work out there, which we summarized here in a basic organizational framework, identifying regulatory functions that respond to chronic oxytocin administration. And you can see that there's a lot of important domains here that oxytocin seems to play a role. Stress and anxiety are already mentioned. There is evidence that oxytocin reduces stress. It reduces anxiety. Maybe the prefrontal cortex tells the amygdala to be quiet and be mellow. So there's some evidence out there for both acute and chronic. Metabolism and weight. There's some obesity studies suggesting beneficial effects of chronic oxytocin administration. But also, for example, in a pathology called Prader-Willi syndrome, I don't know if you guys have heard about this. It's basically an insatiation, is that the word? So when people just don't feel filled up after they've eaten, it's a very severe disease, and it seems like oxytocin can possibly regulate this to some extent. Actually, people die potentially from that because they overeat to the point where their stomach bursts. Social engagement and bonding, we already heard a little bit about this. Mating behavior, parent-child behavior, definitely chronic oxytocin plays a role here. And then also pain and inflammation, just to summarize these functions that oxytocin is involved in. And you can see it's like a lot of different things. But please keep in mind, oxytocin is a very ancient neuropeptide. It's in very primitive species. So I don't find it so surprising that it, has evolved in humans into something that doesn't just do one thing. If it's so basic, it has to actually subserve a lot of different things. So to me, it makes a lot of sense that it's involved in all of these different functions. So we don't know much about chronic administration in aging. What we also don't know, as you could tell from that literature, what does it do in cognition? I talked about attachment, I talked a little bit about cognition already, but there's really no studies out there on oxytocin and cognition. It's more in the social domains and emotional domains, but cognition is such an important domain in aging. Cognitive decline is really one of the prime fears older adults have. So as aging researchers, we wanted to study, oxytocin chronic administration in the context of cognition in aging. And specifically, you can look at many different things when it comes to cognition, behavior, of course, but when you want to look in the brain, again, can look at many different things. But two big things are to look at structure and or at function. So structure meaning, things like how big or small, the volume, and these kind of things. And function would be, where's the activation as we're doing something? So the connectivity data I showed you before, that's function, okay? That doesn't tell me is this a big or small structure. It just tells me there's activation happening. But I can also measure the brain and can find out the volume. So in this next study that I show you, we looked at both. We looked at does oxytocin modulate brain structure and function? I don't expect you to be able to read this. I just want to show you this beast of a study that we started 3 years ago, which we call the Oxytocin Aging Trial. It's actually still ongoing, so if you're interested, let me know. There's also, you can look it up. There's a clinical trial number here. You can look it up online. We have currently completed 87 men. We started actually with the older men because they looked most promising in our single-dose data in terms of potential for benefit. But we have also now, for the last 2 years, added women to the assessment, and the age range is pretty wide, okay, to make sure sure. Gainesville is small, our catchment area is, so you have to kind of give a wide age range. And I'm really also interested in these, how does chronological age in these later years of life play into this? And so basically, I quickly walk you through this. We have very extensive phone pre-screening and screening procedures in place to make sure everyone's safe who comes into the study. And then we have this baseline assessment that spans over 1 to 2 weeks, where people come in either 3 times or 4 times. They come a 4th time if they are eligible for going into the magnetic resonance imaging scanner, which means you can't have big pieces of metal near the brain and some other things. And basically what we do here in the baseline assessment is looking very comprehensively at pretty much everything we can. Socioemotional function, cognition, physical function, different kind of performance-based tests, auditory processing. We also show them different paradigms. For example, they view faces. They have to evaluate the trust of the faces, the affect of the faces. So all these little keywords you've already heard. We really wanted to get an understanding. What does oxytocin do in aging when we administer it chronically? So everyone gets tested at baseline to make sure we know where they stand before they get the intervention. Then people were randomized into the intervention and were basically sent home with spray bottles of either oxytocin or placebo. They didn't know, we didn't know. This is called double blind, when neither the participant nor the experimenter knows what the condition is. And they were asked to administer the intranasal spray twice a day, once in the mornings and once in the evenings, to keep a log, so making sure they're doing it. Also reporting social activities, so having a little diary where they tell us a little bit about sleep, about pain, about different kind of things that happen in their everyday life. We also called them during the intervention every week, or we still do actually, every week, and checking in terms of side effects, making sure this is safe, and they're doing fine and they want to continue and everything. And then they come back in the 4th week of the intervention. So they're still on the oxytocin intervention, but they don't take the oxytocin on the day of testing. We want to make sure that they're not craving the drug. There's no indication that it makes people addicted or anything. But at the same time, if you enter something into the system and you take it away suddenly and you test someone on performance, maybe it's because they really want the oxytocin. And so we give it to them during that week still, but not in the morning of testing, so we don't have an acute effect. And then we do exactly the same thing again as we're doing at baseline, okay? So that you have a comparison after the 4-week intervention. And so that's that. So I can just show you a couple of quick findings at this point, because we're not fully exploring the data quite yet. We're still in the data collection phase, and it's actually not good practice to look at the data before you've completed, okay? You also get excited, and then it goes away with a few more participants and that kind of thing, so you don't want to do that for that reason as well. But what we found was exactly in those regions, amygdala, hippocampus, putamen, you've heard those many times now before. These are the regions that we know oxytocin targets in the brain. That's where we actually saw an enlargement for the oxytocin compared to the placebo group. So after we gave oxytocin for 4 weeks, those regions were larger in participants who had taken, this is actually only the older men for this data here, participants who taken the oxytocin as compared to participants who taken the placebo. This is basically here the example for, you see here the structure putamen, and this is just the data. It's the same thing that I just told you. So for the oxytocin group, we see kind of this positive difference here, and here we see the negative. So this in itself, you don't know, bigger brain, bigger structure, what does it mean? And it's actually not the whole brain gets bigger. It's not like this. The whole brain actually stayed the same. It's these specific structures increased in volume, in gray matter volume. But what's really interesting and super exciting for me as a cognitive aging researcher is that it was in the oxytocin group where this greater volume in putamen, for example here, was positively associated with better processing speed. So the larger volume was related to better cognition. I leave it at this because this is not enough participants to really know for sure. This is just one study. You have to be very careful as a scientist to conclude from one study. You can only control so much as a specific population and everything. You have to replicate, you have to repeat your findings. But this is very promising that maybe even a short intervention of oxytocin could help with increasing processing speed, which, as I said, many cognitive scientists suggest is underlying a lot of other cognitive functions in aging. I also wanted to throw that out. That's actually on the full data set as we have it at this point. We're not seeing side effects of this 4-week intervention. This was very important data for us because nobody before us had given oxytocin for such a long time to older individuals. So across the 140 or 130 people we have now completed, as I told you, we asked them every week, do you have side effects? We called them list of different things. Some was just nasal pathway kind of things, but also cardiovascular and other things. And we are not seeing an effect. So there is no difference, even though it might, look on some instances, but there's no statistical difference between any of those bars. So no documentation of side effects for this intranasal intervention with oxytocin in older individuals. We also did not find any effects on a self-report measure of fatigue. It might be, this is a measure that's actually used typically because I was hoping actually for some effects on physical function as well. But this is a measure that's used in clinical populations quite often who have extreme fatigue. Remember, we are recruiting generally healthy older adults in the study at the moment. Our levels of fatigue in that sample were not very large. So again, there isn't much you can enhance if people aren't really so tired to start with. So we didn't find anything on the self-report measure. We also didn't find anything on one of our performance-based physical measures, grip strength, which is basically a device that you press and it measures how hard you can press, which is a very good indicator for everyday life functioning ability. So if your grip strength goes down, it's very hard to do everyday things. So in aging in particular, it's a good predictor of how well people can still live independently. We did not see an effect that oxytocin would promote this physical feature. But I turned this around for myself and actually was pretty happy when the postdoc presented this data to me because it also means it's not having a side effect on physical performance, which is actually a good thing to know for an investigational drug. So it's not doing something harmful on the physical domain while we're seeing promising data for the cognitive domain. Okay, so this is another quick summary here. 4-week intranasal oxytocin intervention shows some neuroplastic change, so some change possibly in the volume of target regions of oxytocin action, and possibly even this effect on cognition mediated, so produced by this neuroplastic change. And it seems to, from what we can see at this point, that the tested dose, it was just one type of dose we used, one duration, one frequency, and in a generally healthy sample of older individuals, but that didn't seem to do any harm at all. From what we can tell at this point. And so moving forward, I'm very interested in taking a closer look at this, benefits we're seeing possibly for cognition in aging with oxytocin. So I might not go into everything here. I'm going to skip a couple things because I want to leave plenty of time for questions. But I did also want to mention we have just now started enrolling for yet another study. If you know someone who's interested, this is a project I do together with a pain expert, Dr. Yenisei Cruz Almeida at University of Florida. And we are very interested in seeing whether oxytocin, in the context of the opioid crisis and so on, is oxytocin maybe an alternative treatment for chronic pain in aging? So we are recruiting older individuals with knee osteoarthritis into the study. There is some evidence that oxytocin reduces inflammation in the brain and in the rest of the body. And maybe through that mechanism, it reduces pain sensitivity. So it would reduce acute pain applications in the study, but also would actually reduce the chronic pain experience that those chronic patients have in everyday life. That's the hypothesis for this 5-year project that we just started. And so we're pretty excited about having gotten funding for this and taking, a stab in this direction. Again, another way of potentially implementing oxytocin as a treatment in aging. And this is kind of a concluding slide with a couple more things we have to figure out moving forward. Again, it's an investigational drug. It's not heavily studied yet, especially not in our population of older individuals. There's a lot of open questions, not just for chronic oxytocin, also for acute, actually. You know, what happens when we administer through different routes, through the nose, in the periphery, and so on and so forth. What are the right dosages? We had some discussions during the day today about this. We really don't know. You know, we don't know. Should we give more or less? There has to be systematic studies looking at this. Do we have to give it longer, shorter? Is there a sweet spot? If we give it too long and too high, it's going to break the system down. You know, there's a lot of work moving forward, and I can't do this alone. There has to be a lot of other people picking this up. Contextual factors, there's a lot of evidence that oxytocin doesn't always work the same way. It depends a little bit in what kind of situation you are. You know, if it's like a positive social situation, it does one thing. If it's hostile situation, suddenly it increases aggressivity. So there's a lot of interesting manipulations we can do here, looking closer at contextual factors. And then also, what we're starting to see a lot is that not everyone responds in the same way. And I think that's very typical for drug interventions and other interventions as well. You have responders, you have non-responders, and everything in between. So it's not going to be, like I showed you, maybe it's for older men, maybe not for older women. It's too early to say this, but maybe even among the older men, it's not going to do the same thing, and maybe there are some older women who benefit from it as well. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to really figure out who is it beneficial for, if it turns out to be beneficial. So in conclusion, we do think, after having done this now for 5-6 years, that oxytocin, studying oxytocin in the context of aging is actually a very promising approach to try to understand some of the changes we're seeing in aging and also modulate some of them and their relationship to cognition and socioemotional functioning. And then, as I said, kind of to maybe counter some of this normative cognitive decline that we see both in brain and behavior. And the whole goal is basically to, increase gains in aging. So we're really hoping that, in several years from now, this can inform interventions, safe interventions, safe alternatives. Please don't take this as, I go now and get oxytocin. We're not at that point, okay? And I know you can actually, it's an investigational drug, so you can't just get it, but there is actually ways, I should probably also not say this, through the internet to actually get it. But you don't even know what's in those formulations, okay? It's sold as oxytocin, might not be oxytocin, so don't do any of this. So this is really... But we're really interested in looking not only in healthy, but also pathological aging. I already mentioned chronic pain, but think about social anxieties, if it reduces anxiety. Social anxiety is another thing in age that's, definitely prevalent, and so it could help there. Maybe even depression, if it has some effect on affect and social relationships and so on. So there's a lot of work to do moving forward. And we're very grateful for not only a fantastic team of, grad students, undergrads, and postdocs in my lab, and then very close cooperation with the Institute on Aging. So Marco Pahor and other individuals have been very supportive of this research. And then the people at the Magnetic Resonance Imaging Center at UF, and some specific collaborators that I wanted to highlight here. And we have been very fortunate to have received NIH and NSF and so on funding, and have very nice cooperation from nasal spray pump company and bottle. There's all the little details when you do this kind of stuff. You start talking with nasal spray pump companies and that stuff. But we have been very fortunate of having these people on board for our work. Thank you very much. Oh, so yeah, I pick. I should. Why don't we just start here?
If you started taking oxytocin and you did it over a period of time, would you wonder if your natural levels of oxytocin would go down if you stopped taking it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very valid question, good question. And there is not no rigorous research out there on this. There is no really suggestion at this point, and in our data we didn't see that people are reporting craving for it to the extent where they necessarily would want to continue, for example. We have, in the study, we measure oxytocin levels before and after. We haven't assayed those samples yet. We have to wait until all the data is completed, then we will be able to measure what were your level before, what was your level right after you right at the end of your intervention. So, but again, this doesn't tell us, is your natural level going down, or is it, so we don't know this. We really don't know. In Prader-Willi syndrome folks that I mentioned before, and I'm not an expert on this disease, but I know that a one-time intervention, and definitely a shorter-term chronic intervention, changes their, it's called endogenous, so the natural oxytocin system for good for the rest of their life. And sometimes actually in some of those individuals, it makes them not good responders down the road for later interventions. But it doesn't mean when it's in these folks that it's necessarily in everyone. But there is some indication in that population that it has long-term, even kind of epigenetic kind of modifications and so on. Yes? Mm-hmm.
Go Gators. Thank you.
I'm from Germany. I like soccer. I try to pretend, but...
Your team has had 6 years to study oxytocin. With all of your experience, do you think that a senior would have gains if they maintained an attitude of severe gratitude? Would it impact the hypothalamus and maybe have the hypothalamus generate more oxytocin?
Mm-hmm. So it's also a good question. I don't know if it would generate more oxytocin. There is definitely research out there suggesting that a positive attitude in life helps a lot in aging. It helps for cognition, and it helps for your social relationship, and it helps for all of this. And I'm a firm believer that this has some neurobiological process with it. It's not the case that, we do know we're releasing oxytocin naturally in interpersonal relationships during sex, for example, when we're petting our dog or our cat, when we're hugging or kissing our children, So there is these situations that can release it, but it's not that when we enter oxytocin, people become happy. It's not like this. There is not evidence at this point that it increases positive affect very reliably. I'd like to tell this little anecdote. There was, when we started the oxytocin work at UF, one of my lab managers mentioned, she was pregnant at that point, and she mentioned her midwife told her there must be a community of older individuals in Gainesville, and I never actually tracked them down, and maybe they're not there anymore, who are getting oxytocin from abroad, from Canada, but they're also consuming marijuana at the same time. And they're doing hug parties. And I'm sure there is a lot of happiness and so on in the, but I don't know if it's the, marijuana or the oxytocin or the combination or the hugging or whatever else goes on. So, all right. There's one sorry, I chased you to the back. Is that okay? Oh, okay, perfect.
Have you looked at older individuals who were single, living alone, versus individuals of the same age who are living with families and have an extended network of friends?
It's a very important question. So we do have that information for our individuals. We asked this. We have not systematically looked at this in our statistical analyses. It might also, in our sample, a little bit be a little bit of a problem because we already have a relatively small number to start with. 100 sounds like a lot, but it's actually not for most statistical testing. However, there is actually quite some research out there suggesting that, for example, oxytocin's effects on inflammation, reducing inflammation and wound healing, they only work if the partner is in the hospital, if there is social contact at the same time. That's these contextual factors that I mentioned. It's really, and as a scientist, it's sometimes a little bit annoying if it only works under some condition and then you don't know, But it seems like when there is, as I said, when there is a social context that's a positive social context, oxytocin possibly does something different than when it's a hostile context or other contexts. So this speaks a little bit to your suggestion that maybe it's because, yes, it gets released, as I said, in these natural, when we touch someone else. And we do ask, I should mention that too, we do ask our participants when they come in to respond to what we call an intake interview. And we basically just ask them a couple questions about the last 24 hours. And we always do this first thing when they come to a session. And we want to know, did you have sex? Did you have any other physical contact? Did you pet your dog or any other pet? Because we want to actually know what kind of physical social interactions and other things they had, also stress levels and things like that. Yes?
You were showing that the oxytocin levels in young women is very high. Does that drop at menopause?
So again, unfortunately, there isn't super systematic studies in humans, or there is nothing actually that would follow them. Ideally, you would follow longitudinally, so in the same individual, right? But even if you compare, there is no research on middle age comparing it directly on those levels. Oxytocin and estradiol interact a lot. So we tried, for example, for our older women, we try to recruit women who are postmenopausal so that we're controlling there. We're also making sure for the young women that they are all in the same phase of their menstruation cycle. So at least we have some control over it because these are very relevant questions. And definitely the oxytocin and the estrogen system interact heavily. So it's not something that might actually be one of the reasons why it's not so heavily studied in women. It's much more complicated to study these kind of pharmacos things in men than in women because we have cycles. They don't. They do too, it feels like sometimes, right? Yes.
I must have missed something. What is this? Thank you. At any rate, have you done any studies with chronic brain injury? Or are there any going on?
So in our sample, we exclude individuals with brain damage. Again, I'm targeting generally healthy older individuals, and also because we're looking in the brain, we're trying to avoid that there is major damage in the brain because it changes the whole dynamic in the brain. There is, to my knowledge, no, that has not been looked at. I'm trying to actually get money for Alzheimer funding in this context because now I'm seeing a connection possibly between cognition and oxytocin. I would love to study this, for example, in Alzheimer's patients.
We have a lot of them here, thanks to Vietnam and thanks to Afghanistan.
Yeah.
The other question is just a simple one. From the physiological point of view, the thing that I think most related to aging was a night adaptation of vision. It deteriorates almost directly.
I have it.
But it deteriorates almost directly with age. You can almost predict somebody's age from it. Have you ever looked at the effect of oxytocin on that adaptation phenomenon?
I have not, but what we have in the chronic administration study, in the 4-week study, is we do eye tracking. And we will be able to at least take the so eye tracking, I don't know if you know this, it basically, you can present something on the computer screen and you basically measure with a camera, it's non-invasive, it just measures where do people look, what happens to their pupil, is it dilated or not, how do they move over what you're presenting. So we will be able to look at some of those things in our data. Not night vision in particular, but at least some of the visual scanning that people do before and after the oxytocin intervention and kind of compare and see.
Adaptation studies can be done without basically dealing with the cognitive part.
Yeah. So from this review we did, I haven't really seen any sort of work looking into something that would, that would go in that direction, but, it's worthwhile looking. It's so hard to choose and pick, and there's a bunch behind you. I think you had your arm up for quite a while.
Other than the things you've already mentioned, is there any evidence, or do we suspect anything else that can increase the levels of oxytocin? In particular, maybe diet or supplements or exercise, anything more natural that people could do?
Hugging. Lots of hugging is good, I think. I don't know of any literature that physical activity, I mean, maybe other people know this, because I know some people here study oxytocin as well. Do you know something about this? Yeah?
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't going to mention this, but you know, getting a massage releases
Yes.
endorphins. So my suggestion is that more people should be getting more massages.
Yeah. And this is actually true. There is a scientist in China who currently looks at whether he does foot massage, whether that actually changes the natural levels of, or not so natural, but the endogenous levels of oxytocin, this physical touch. I was also thinking, so one thing we measure is what type of food they ate in the 24 hours leading up to, because there's some suggestion that saturated fats and so on could also change some of this. So, but yeah. Yeah. Sorry, Michelle.
When looking at some of your early graphs, there was like one where I was like, the pink dots were the young women, right? There was like one young woman who was like way down at the bottom,
Yes,
and there was like one old guy way up at the top, and it reminded me of beehives, and they found that with genetic diversity, certain bees with certain genetic strains will thermoregulate at some temperatures and they just flap their wings.
Yeah.
At certain temperatures, the greater diversity within the hive, the greater the satisfactory outcome of temperature regulation in the hive is. So I'm wondering if maybe there could be a parallel in human society for, you want to have some anxious people, and you want to have some who don't, give a,
Yeah,
whatever.
it's
So-
beneficial for society, to give
Yeah.
everyone oxytocin and make them all the same, right, or something like this. But yeah, I think it's also an important observation. And what I would like to add there, so the young women, some of them were on hormone replacement and some were not. We controlled for this in our statistical analyses, but nevertheless, it can actually affect some of those other measures, like anxiety, for example, and so on. And I did not include based on this, because if you exclude someone for something, then you have no participants. There's so many reasons to exclude. But that actually probably created a higher variability among the young women overall in all the different measures. And also what I would like to say from a statistical standpoint is more interesting probably for a scientist, but like if you have small sample sizes like we have, only a few people, sometimes one or two people who go extremely in one direction, they really screw up your effects, It looks like you have an effect or you don't. So what we typically do is we look, do we have outliers? And then we remove them and we test it again and see whether we have the same effects. And that's what we write in the publication to make sure it's not one or two people who are so extreme. But I think it also gets back to the point of there is responders and non-responders probably. And yes, your proficiency level on something actually matters as well. If you are proficient in social skills, oxytocin helps you in a different way than if you're non-proficient. And it actually suggests that, the socially proficient possibly benefit more than the ones who are already at the top anyways. There isn't much to improve there.
On that note, let's thank our speaker.